Hey there, kids. It's not your dad, but your lore dad, here to dig up yet another mod out of the lore grave. This time, we're looking at Red Vistula. The mod's name explains its premise pretty well. The Soviet Union manages to make the Vistula red by preventing the miracle on the Vistula. This results in a Polish SSR being integrated into the Soviet Union, as well as alternate leadership of the Union rather than Stalin or Trotsky, but instead Bukharin. While already a decent enough starting point for a Hearts of Iron 4 mod, unfortunately, things quickly go downhill from there plausibility-wise. For example, the former Polish Republic somehow ends up controlling Danzig, while the Germans control the rest of their 1914 imperial border territories. This minority-rule exile government somehow remains in control and in power due to France guaranteeing their independence. This extremely awkward situation is unaddressed for a decade and a half, until a civil war hits Germany between Democrats, nationalists, and communists. The semi-exiled Polish nationalists claim the rest of the corridor and begin attempts to gain the rest of German Poland. But this escalates into a war with the Polish SSR. Eventually, this conflict would escalate to be a Second World War, with the borderlines of the Democrats and the Communist Germans being the primary front lines for the French Entente and the Third Internationale. While I believe that the beginning of this premise fumbles, the idea of having a French-led faction fighting the Soviets in a grand war to determine the fate of Europe is pretty awesome. Besides the primary point of divergence causing natural consequences for the future of Germany, Poland, and France, the rest of the world seems to take an approach of historical corruption, that being, making the history different with the excuse of alternate history, rather than a consequence of the primary point of divergence. For example, this is China. Another important example would be France's ideological alignment. Despite the point divergence not justifying it, as well as other legal issues with the age of the character not being eligible to become French president, Napoleon VI would become president, and during the course of the mod, reclaimed the French Empire. While I can see the appeal of a Napoleonic France, especially in this timeline where France is destined to march as far east as Moscow once again, there are several problems mod-wise that make this difficult for me to establish as a core aspect of the mod. There's an aspect of a Napoleonic France fighting the Soviet Union in an epic retelling of the Napoleonic Wars against a new ideological threat, and the tragic destruction of a nation who had only a taste of freedom after just over a century of division. While these two aspects of the mod seem like they can be compatible with each other, I find that by combining these two aspects, they make the premise far weaker. While I'm just starting to understand this idea of a core aspect of a mod and can't elaborate much more on it just yet, what I can say is that in order to take another look at this mod, we're going to need to eliminate one of the cores. And unfortunately, it's got to be Napoleonic France. Yakoan, the last remaining developer of the mod, has tried to make adjustments to the lore by having Napoleonic support only happening during 1936, and that Napoleon VI would become leader later on into the lifespan. But I feel like the entire Napoleonic aspect of this mod just has to go. There's certainly a potential for a mod of a Napoleonic revival in 1936, but for the sake of my video, I'll be focusing on the Poland aspect of the mod. And I think that the results will be far more compelling than you may initially realize. As usual, we're going to take my holistic approach to taking a single point of divergence, cascading outwards, to avoid the scope of the scenario getting out of control. But the main question is, when do we diverge? For the sake of keeping things simple, and in areas of history that I'm familiar with, I'm going to make this point of divergence similar to German October's, with a slight tweak to encourage a different trajectory. For those who haven't seen it yet, German October's timeline diverges from our history when, after the miracle on the Vistula, Hans von Seitz stages a border conflict with the Polish Republic, bringing Germany into a war with Poland. After the Polish are defeated, Hans von Seitz defies the Weimar Republic's acceptance of a League of Nations mandate of Poland, and instead attempts to take over Germany as a military dictator. Hey, it's Editor Dad. I just realized I didn't quite explain what's going on here. So, a League of Nations mandate was a compromise that was made between the Wilsonian 14 points and the European powers' territorial claims. Every colony that the Europeans had gained against their adversaries, like the Germans or the Turks, were turned into mandates. So there was the Mandate of Syria, Mandate of Iraq, etc. The idea behind the mandate is that it would be administered by one nation as an overlord, but with the idea that this nation would allow for their mandate to eventually become an independent country. So in the case of Germany, Germany was told by the Treaty of Versailles they need to give Poland a corridor and give them Poznan and stuff. So by adopting a League of Nations mandate of Poland, they're still allowing for the Polish state to exist, just only in the German-occupied territories. The idea would be that once Poland is fully restored border-wise, then, eventually, the civilian government would become a fully independent country, not related to Germany. But this also means there would be some people in the German state that would just want to annex their 1914 border, who would be in conflict with the liberals, who would want to restore Poland according to the Treaty of Versailles. Anyway, sorry for going too fast, I just forgot to explain. But to bring you back to the video's context, in the German October timeline, Hans von Seeckt refuses to transfer these occupied territories to a mandate of Poland, and instead tries to become a military dictator. This causes a mini warlord period, during which the Hamburg Uprising occurs, according to the German October operation. Thus, Trotsky invades Germany to support them, ultimately integrating northern Germany into the Soviet Union, and afterwards leading to Trotsky becoming the leader of the USSR. In my version of Red Vistula, the point of divergence will be similar. In early August of 1920, Stalin had defied orders to reinforce Tukhachevsky's attack on Warsaw. Lenin, Trotsky, and Tukhachevsky had all claimed that his defiance of orders is what eventually culminated in the utter defeat of the Bolsheviks in the Soviet-Polish War. Taking this assumption to be true, that if Stalin obeyed orders, Warsaw would have remained under Soviet control, we'll use this as our point of divergence. With Warsaw remaining under Soviet control, Hans von Seeckt would be confident enough to stage a border conflict in order to claim the 1914 border, but not be confident enough to resist the League of Nations solution to found a Polish mandate. I figure Seeckt would act differently given that in Red Vistula's timeline, the Soviets never lost control over Warsaw, while in the German October they had, making this border conflict more of a desperate attempt to avoid Soviet expansion into German territory, rather than him playing a key part in their victory. Without Stalin's defiance of orders, he would not be denounced by his comrades, preventing the German October outcome of him leaving the Soviet Union disgraced, and instead allow for him to continue to influence his position in the party. I'll leave the exact specifics of who leads the USSR to someone who may be more familiar with Russian history. For now, let's look into the ramifications of this point of divergence. While the Soviet-Polish War was occurring, there was a desperate struggle in Anatolia between Greece and Turkey. Under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, the Turks would organize a rabid resistance against the terms of their World War I treaty, fighting to ensure their independence from the heavy economic oppression that would come with their acceptance of the treaty. In our timeline, the Turks had eventually pushed back their occupiers far enough to negotiate a peace which, while many of the factors of Sevres had remained, such as the International Straits Zone, there were no Greek acquisitions in Anatolia and no economic zones either. This victory was possible not only due to the tenacity of the Turks, but their support of the Soviet Union. The USSR had a very special interest in ensuring Mustafa Kemal's victory against the West. If the Treaty of Sevres or the Megali idea had gone through, the Bosphorus Straits would be under the control of the anti-communist West. If Turkey were to avoid agreeing to the terms of the treaty, the Bosphorus Straits would be under a neutral but Soviet-leading country's control, potentially extending their sphere of influence beyond denying the West the Straits. Due to the Soviets needing more garrisons to establish control in the unruly Polish territories, plus the rest of their eastern territories which hadn't been properly consolidated, the Soviets could not afford to support the Turkish nearly as much as they had in our history. Therefore, the monetary and munitions support of the Turkish would be cut off soon after the Soviets had controlled all of Poland, leading to the Turkish national movement to be weaker. This alone isn't enough to cause a collapse of the Turkish independence movement, but I argue that with the Soviet annexation of Poland, the West would be far more reactive, leading to them intervening far more than in our timeline. Despite their exhaustion, the anti-communist fears would push the Entente to enforce the Treaty of Sevres and deny the Soviet Union access to the Mediterranean. As a result of this increased intervention, the British would manage the International Straits Zone, with Greece gaining the rest of Turkey's European territories, as well as some Anatolian concessions. And while there were no economic zones, the Turkish are still subjected to other humiliating turns, indebting themselves to the French, British, and Italians, increasing the resentment of the average Turk against the West, and laying the seeds for a political radicalization towards fashion. But before we determine Turkey's ideology, we must study the rest of these consequences of the point of divergence. In our timeline, the Soviet Union had supported a Moldavian communist revolution, which would most likely have defected to the USSR as soon as possible. Despite the Soviets' aggressive expansion into Poland, Romania, and potential shenanigans in the Caucasus, the West would not be able to form a united response to this crisis. Despite Romania being a vital part of France's policy of cordon sanitaire, the removal of Poland in their containment strategy has led to their foreign policy shifting rapidly. While the obvious solution would be to unite with Germany against the Soviet Union and the expansionist Italians, French pride would get in the way of them extending an olive branch to their historic rival. In the average Frenchman's mind, the Germans got away with it again, and would instead focus on finding ways to curb German influence expanding, even if it means collaborating with the Soviet Union, but more on that later. Thus, with no war-capable allies and vultures circling their Greater Romania, the League of Nations would ensure that the Moldavian crisis does not escalate to a larger war, ending the dream of a Greater Romania far earlier than our history. While there are certainly very large ramifications of the destruction of Poland and the expansion of the Soviet Union into their former Imperial Russian territory, there are no major elements that I feel need to be discussed. There is, of course, allowing for communist movements to be more successful in their neighboring states, but I feel like we've already given the Soviet Union enough of an advantage in this timeline. With that, we can start to study the geopolitical ramifications of this scenario in earnest. The Soviet victory in Warsaw would set off alarm bells in Germany to an extraordinary amount. It's extremely likely that the alarmism of the German fashionistas that had peddled in their propaganda would reach a larger amount of Germans. However, I believe that this also would be true with every other non-communist organization in Germany. And since Germany was given the mandate of Poland, they're now also a member of the League of Nations. And the fact that Germany was the new bulwark against Bolshevism had meant that despite what the British and French may need out of Germany war reparations-wise, the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles may be reduced to keep Germany stable enough to resist the Bolshevik threat. With this in mind, as well as the point of divergence, I believe Hans von Seeckt would be a brilliant starting leader for Germany. Since he had managed to assert German territorial integrity through his invasion of Poland, but had also successfully enabled Germany to become a member of the League of Nations through his transfer of military control to a Polish civilian government, he would be extremely popular and would be a unifying figure for the German nation to rally behind. However, he's due to die in December in 1936, leaving us at a crossroads. Will the next chancellor be an authoritarian military man who would seek to rule as a dictator, like Kurt von Schleicher? Or would he be a liberal candidate, seeking to reinforce their democratic institutions? But regardless of whoever ends up leading Germany in 1937, would the German state ever be strong enough to take on the Soviet Union? There was a brilliant YouTube comment on a video that I've lost, but it was an extremely compelling argument for why Germany could not have won World War II. It was simply their ideology. If the German fashionistas hadn't seen the East as their Lebensraum, and instead had focused on liberating the minorities of the Soviet Union who were initially extremely eager to collaborate, Operation Barbarossa would have been an extremely quick engagement. Instead, the Germans had oppressed every non-German they could in preparation for settlement. Could you imagine the effectiveness of the advance to the east if instead of oppression of every village, every acquisition was a genuine liberation? Would Stalin's annexation of Poland, with their increased access to minerals, industry, and manpower, even be enough to properly withstand this invasion? This advance east could be a very tactical and engaging invasion for the German player to execute. If the USSR is not one tag, and still represents each Soviet republic as a tag, any capitulation of these states could lead to them becoming a supervised state of the German Republic. Therefore, instead of needing to manage resistance as they continue their march, they would instead be full cores of their new allies without any resistance or penalties to resource extraction. This dynamic would mean that a Soviet Union player would need to manage their defense in a much more conscientious way. How will they organize their front lines when a German capture of a capital leads to a significant boon for their adversary? This idea of doing an Eastern invasion to genuinely liberate the East and potentially found a European Union is extremely compelling to me, and I hope that this idea is exciting to you too. With this design idea in mind, the Soviet Union is at a larger disadvantage than anticipated. What sort of things could they do in order to prevent the rapid advance of the Germans into the motherland? Well, they would need to make some significant treaties with several other nations. What I propose is that the Soviet Union be in a mutual defensive pact with France. As mentioned before, France would be a democratic state, but anti-German, but would be under the leadership of the United Front. Due to the fact that France is left-leaning, as well as their mutual geopolitical interests against Germany, I believe that the Franco-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance would be ratified to a much larger extent than our history. In our timeline, this pact of mutual guarantee was signed, but was eventually discarded in favor of the Soviet Union collaborating with the Germans in the partition of Poland. A reason for this falling out was that the treaty could only do so much without conflicting with the Locarno treaties, which are essentially pre-Mustache Man signs of appeasement, as these treaties had guaranteed that the West would reconsider their eastern border in exchange for continued concessions to the West. However, given that Germany already has its 1914 border solidified, this treaty would not exist, and the Soviet Union would not need to collaborate with the Germans to defeat Poland. Therefore, a Soviet-French mutual defense pact, with the potential of a full alliance as world tension increases, is a genuine possibility. While the French would be decently strong, just like our timeline, their internal political situation is extremely unstable. The United Front itself, let alone the policies they would enact according to their socialist principles, would alienate the established political and military elite. This dynamic had led to the Vichy French in their collaboration with Germany shortly after their surrender. With this dynamic in mind, it's possible that Germany could manage to blitz through the French quickly, prior to focusing their troops east. However, that would require a blitz through Belgium. And while Mustache Man was certainly bold for deciding to do this strategy after it had failed in the First World War, there was no risk of Britain getting involved in the conflict during the invasion because they already were involved. In this situation, Britain would be uninvolved. Since Germany and France are both democracies, the ideological component of their alignment would not be a deciding factor. Instead, whoever they align with depends on which nations are a greater threat to their empire. But even in this case, both options are equally bad. Unmatched German hegemony in the East, especially under liberated democracies, could lead to an economic bloc never seen before in European history. And yet, a Franco-Soviet division of the country would lead to the already problematic Soviet Union spreading their anti-imperialist ideology further west, with the French political instability potentially leading to a Western European spread of communism. It's for this reason that I believe, at least in the beginning, Britain would remain neutral, but potentially leaning towards aligning with Germany. A democratic Britain and Germany allying? Is this Project Stresa all over again? Well, not quite, because the Latin Axis would be limited to only Italy herself. Italy in this timeline is pretty diplomatically isolated. The advent of the Pact of Steel had enabled Italy to finally execute their designs on all of their neighbors. However, without a large power like Germany facilitating their expansion, Italy would find it extremely difficult to gather enough strength to reasonably contest the French-guaranteed Yugoslavia and expand in favor of their allies, Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria. However, with the inevitable German-French War, the potential of the Italians to march into Yugoslavia is possible. In this event, France may even abandon Yugoslavia utterly, the reason being that, if they guarantee Yugoslav independence, the potential for Italy to end up at war with Germany is null and void. In order to ensure that France did not need to manage yet another front line in their war with Germany, and allow for the possibility for Italy to somehow end up at war with Germany, Yugoslavia would be abandoned by the French. This Italian focus on passivity may be contrary to the general characteristics of the hyper-militarized fashionistas, but it's not without its geopolitical benefit. By sitting back and observing the war as it manifests, Italy could either negotiate an entry into the war against France by partitioning zones of influence in the north and south, or collaborate with the Franco-Soviet alliance against the Germans, gaining land for future client states, or expanding their current allies' influence. If the French and the Soviets defeat the Germans, there will no doubt be a follow-up war, where the Soviets attempt to instigate a French communist revolution. If this war were to break out, then Italy would have another opportunity to negotiate either massive land acquisitions in a Molotov-Ribbentrop-style partition of influence, or they could negotiate the entry into the war in the defense of France in exchange for territorial concessions. Either way, building up slowly and expanding piece by piece is the best course of action for Italy. Of course, it wouldn't be a world war without including the rest of the world. In this case, I feel like the Japanese invasions of Southeast Asia may occur, but slightly differently. The Japanese ambitions against Indochina may be a negotiated concession by the French in order to prevent the Soviet Union from facing a threat to their east. Or perhaps is exactly what leads to the Japanese abandoning the southern expansion doctrine in favor of a northern one. While it's certainly a possibility, I don't think that Japan would pursue this approach, especially as weakening the Soviet Union would benefit Germany, the friend of their enemy, China. In our timeline, the Germans were extremely amicable with the Republic of China, as they traded their bauxite in large quantities. The Chinese had even hired Hans von Seitz to help them in their encirclement campaigns against the Chinese communists. With their mutual enemy of the Soviet Union, the Republic of China would be a natural ally to the Germans, leading to them to be in conflict with Japan, as much as they can be, however, given their lack of a continent-spanning empire. Perhaps a Pearl Harbor attack is what eventually brings the USA into the German alliance, which will certainly tip the scales in Europe. Or perhaps the USA only ends up at war with Japan, which leaves the fate of Europe exclusively to the Europeans. However this world war manifests, I'm quite satisfied with how dynamic and unique this scenario is. But there's some other things that we haven't covered yet that I'd like to go into more detail about. When it comes to the Spanish Civil War, I feel like the Republicans should be weighted to win more often, due to France being more interventionist and on the Soviet Union's side. However, the vanilla dynamic of them immediately becoming a Soviet puppet should instead be replaced with the guaranteed communist revolt if the Soviet Union declares war on France. If you want to balance out the factions more, a Soviet-aligned Bulgaria could be a cool nation, especially if they found the Communist Balkan Federation, which was being considered at the time. If the war ends up involving a Germany that's successful in liberating Poland in their mandate, and the Italians end up at war with the Germans, a Polish fashionista revolt casting off the German influence in the state would be a great way for them to become a truly independent state, especially if a leader like Schleicher is attempting to reintegrate Poznan and Danzig directly into the Reich again. A cool dynamic that I think would be really fun is having Turkey be some sort of lone wolf state, kind of like Finland, where they can't join a faction, but will act in the interests of one of their potential allies. For example, Turkey has a lot of gain by going to war with the Franco-Soviet faction, and while Germany would certainly like the help against their adversaries, they certainly wouldn't want to be allied to the state that's seeking to go to war with Britain and her sphere. In the same way, Italy would potentially love an ally who would be willing to open up a secondary front line against the British Empire's Middle Eastern acquisitions, but would not want to end up fighting the entirety of the Soviet Union on their behalf either. Perhaps the Turkish are playing both sides and will eventually be swayed to join a faction, just like how Vanilla Turkey was designed. You know, looking at the French-Soviet ending potential here, like, you could even have it where the Second Corps comes back. If the Soviet Union invades France, and for some reason there's a Napoleonic candidate in the army, I don't know why that would be the case, but if there was, then it would be like, oh my god, we need a Napoleonite, and then you can have the Napoleon back, even though it's the United Front. Like, I don't know, like, you would need to face like a civil war with all the left-wing supporters and like a communist revolution, find a way to solidify the political scenario, then have Napoleon, and then guess what? You get your blank check to subjugate all of Europe, bro. You have your Napoleon. You can do it, dude. You just have to make it very, very specific. The outcome needs to be that France doesn't have too large of a left wing, beats Germany, faces a communist revolution in a Operation Unthinkable narrative, gets couped, and then installs a Napoleonic candidate, and then it's like Endsieg, but if you win the Endsieg, then you get your Napoleon. You Cohen, I figured it out, finally. We did it. Everybody, we did it. Well, that's my take on Red Vistula. Thank you for tuning in. While it's certainly very different than the original, I feel like this is an improvement to the original scenario. But will it be enough to revive the mod? And will the Red Vistula developers even consider adopting these radical changes? If Yakoan and the other Red Vistula developers don't want to take these ideas and concepts, that's completely fine. All I ask is that if anybody else takes my ideas here and makes a mod out of it, that you be sure to recognize that it's inspired by Red Vistula and pick a separate name to avoid a conflict of identity. As usual, my Loregrave discussion channel is open for people to organize and discuss, regardless of the outcome, and Red Vistula's Discord link is in the description. Shout out to Grud, Jubs, Solo Leo, Louis Avant, Cindy Beatty, Alt History Uncle, and Seeking Sentience for being channel members. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to have your name shouted out at the end of my video, please consider supporting the channel by getting a membership. Clean your room. Just go clean your room. I've been cleaning a lot in my house, so that's my advice to you. I hope you have a good day.
Bye-bye.
When you say, please subscribe.
Please subscribe.
Have a good day.
Daddy, now someone's staying here.
Oh,
Lock the
okay.
door for me.
Okay, are you gonna finish my video?
Yeah.
Okay, good luck.
And I need to move this away. Now. I don't need this. Now I don't need this.